I want to welcome everyone to the second of the Faculty Research Scholarship Series presentations for this academic year, 2020-2021. Dr. Saul Neely, who is Associate Professor of English and Director of Composition at Heritage University, and recently having joined us from Alaska, from the University of Alaska Southwest, is giving the presentation today, People Singing in the Earth, Indigenous Phenomenology and Decolonial Legibility. So I am turning the presentation over to Dr. Neely at this moment. Thank you so much. Let's give him a round of applause. Bravo.
Thank you. Wado, Sio Tuweja Nagara Ulehelisti. Welcome everybody. It's good to see you. It's a real pleasure to be able to sort of introduce myself and my work through this faculty scholarship series. So I appreciate the invitation. I drove onto campus one time and turned around and drove off because I didn't have permission yet to be on there. So I haven't really had a chance to meet everybody in sort of the traditional campus atmosphere. So doing something like this, I hope will occasion a greater intimacy amongst colleagues. And so I'm grateful to be here. And I thought that I would sort of present my scholarship series in a kind of comprehensive way, taking you through different movements in my thinking and in my activism and my work that leads me to the point where I'm at right now. And so I'm thinking that I won't keep the screen on the whole time. Maybe I'll actually stop sharing for the moment. It's not that big of a PowerPoint that I have, but it has a couple quotations that I might pull from a little bit later on. But in order to sort of introduce the scholarship, I thought that, I might give you a little brief biography and talk a little bit about my work at UAS and the sabbatical research I did last fall semester. And in terms of that biography, it's interesting that when I first started college, I'm a first generation college student, and even that needs some kind of qualification because I attempted college right after high school, but then my family sort of fell apart. My parents got divorced, just a lot of family crises. And so I didn't even I wasn't even successful at my first attempt at college, which I think is an important story for a lot of our students to hear. But when I was 18 years old, I was raised by my grandfather to be so proud of our Cherokee heritage and our Cherokee culture and identity. He told us stories about our family. I've got this beautiful portrait right behind me. It's my great-great-grandfather, who was the firstborn after the Trail of Tears in Tahlequah. He helped make the bricks for what became the Cherokee National Courthouse, which is today the Cherokee National History Museum. It's one of the architectural gems of the Cherokee Nation. And I grew up with that real sense of pride in being Cherokee. When I was 18, I was going to move in with his brother, because my grandpa spoke a little bit of Cherokee, but his brother was the last fluent speaker in our language, because he had graduated at Cherokee High School. He spoke it fluently. But my grandfather, his brother, had been kicked out of 6th grade for beating up a teacher. And, this is Oklahoma history here, right? And, but as I was preparing or thinking about moving in with my great uncle, whose name was Sequoia, but everybody called him Bull, he had a stroke. And one of the consequences of a stroke was he lost the ability to talk. And so like that, the language in my family kind of evaporated. I like to say that my grandfather spoke handshake Cherokee. So he knew enough Cherokee to greet you and ask how you're doing and these things, but he didn't speak it like his brother did. And right around that time is when my grandfather, when I complained about this, my grandfather said to me, well, how does it feel to be the last of the damn Mohicans? And, you know, I was 18 years old and this was really troubling to me, but it's not surprising because if you're familiar with the famous end of the trail image, the end of the Trail of Tears image, you know, the native guy on the horse and his head's bent over and the horse's head is leaning down. Everybody's exhausted. The wind is blowing the horse's tail between his legs. That was such a powerful image and trope during the 60s and early 70s as my grandfather was making and selling Indian jewelry in the powwow circuit. He had that image in at least 6 different places in his house. Today's generation of young Indigenous activists find that image highly problematic, right? Because it contributes to the vanishing Indian trope. But that was my grandpa's response. How does it feel to be the last of the damn Mohicans? And at that point, you know, I was infatuated. I was really loving philosophy and poetry. I was writing poetry, studying philosophy, you know, as anybody at 18 years old with a family in crisis, trying to figure out who you are and what your vocation in life is. And right around that time, my dad was telling me, you've got to give it up. You got to give it up. You got to give up the whole Cherokee identity. Go study European philosophy. Go to Europe. Go travel through Europe. Study European philosophy. And so the way I describe this is I was seduced by white supremacy. Today, my dad totally regrets having ever said that. And I never actually gave it up. I continued working with Native American Lit throughout my graduate career in graduate school. I completed Cornell University School of Criticism and Theory with an emphasis in Native American literature. A third of my dissertation is on Native American literature. And so I never really gave it up. But then when I moved to Juneau, Alaska, on Shingadani, the traditional ancestral lands of the Tlingit people, and I started teaching at UAS, I met a very good friend of mine who's Tlingit and Inupiaq, Ishmael Hope. And I invited him, my first summer class at UAS was on trickster hermeneutics. And I invited him to come tell Raven stories. And at the end of class, when I was driving him back home, we had this really incredible conversation. And then we would continue to have these conversations for years. To this day, Ishmael is one of my best friends and my best colleagues. But one of the admonishments he gave me was, your credentials in Native American literature are fine, but unless you have a close proximity to the oral indigenous literary source material, then you're never going to really have that kind of deep phenomenological responsiveness to story. And so it was with Ishmael that I did a lot of work thinking about that oral indigenous source material, phenomenologically. What does it do to the body? What modalities of consciousness are needed in order for the wisdom of these stories to become legible? So it's great to study Thomas King, and it's great to study Joy Harjo or Linda Hogan, all of these authors who I absolutely adore and love. But it's all enriched if you go to the source material. And that's sort of where I've been heading with my work. Ishmael and we describe our work as taking place at the intersection of Indigenous phenomenology and also Indigenous cosmopolitanism. You know, before contact, you know, I think my Cherokee ancestors before contact had rich trading networks, right? All over Southeast United States, all the way up to the Great Lakes. And they used the Mobilian trade jargon as a way of facilitating that trade. And the same with Northern California up the Pacific Northwest coast.
Hello. Hi. How are you? I'm good. How are you doing? Did you get a flu shot today? I got my flu shot a long time ago. I mean, like several weeks ago. Yeah, I thought I saw you in the line. I wasn't sure. No, I went over and Katie gave it to me.
Can we use vaccine?
Mm-hmm. Where are you now? I'm on Heritage Campus in my office.
Awesome. Thank you. And so, and the same is true of the Pacific Northwest coast, the trade routes, the use of trade languages and these kinds of things. And I think even today in the 21st century, we can still talk about a kind of indigenous cosmopolitanism where we can draw from rich sources of rich ecumenical sources about thinking about the quality of story and what becomes legible to us through the certain quality of story. So that's just a little bit of background where we're at. And I should add that all of this really sort of came to a culminating moment when last fall semester, my dad and my daughter and I traveled the Trail of Tears as 3 generations of Cherokee Nation citizens. And it was over the course of that trip that my dad really had a homecoming for himself, profoundly moved and transformed by the journey. And he really began, I'm actually publishing an article on it. It's due today. I have a deadline today. And it's called The Trail Where They Cried. And the subtitle is On Displacement and Homecoming Across Generations. And because one of the things my dad learned is that, you know, it takes one generation. I mean, almost every Indigenous family has this, right? The story of one generation where we're told to give it up. And I think that that's part of what it is to be Indigenous in this country, right? That displacement, historical displacement from our homeland over across the Trail of Tears, and then the further displacement from Oklahoma to Central Valley, California that my grandfather made in the 1950s, you know, when we had that real pressure with the Indian Relocation Act of 1956 to get Indigenous families to assimilate into mainstream urban American culture. You know, that's the story of my family. Then my father went and fought in Vietnam, and I was born into the Army. I was an Army brat. You know, my dad graduated, or I graduated high school the same month that my dad retired from the military. So displacement is my story. And displacement doesn't make us less Indigenous. In many regards, it is the Indigenous experience in Americas. And I think that he really had this profound revelation about that. So I'd like to start with a story, a Cherokee story, and it's about displacement, and it's a prophetic account of the historical violence that was to come, and in the Trail of Tears. And I should say real quick that I trace my Cherokee ancestry back to my 5 times great grandmother. This is interesting. My 5 times great grandmother, Leitoti, is recorded in the Bureau of American Ethnology in a report from 1889, I think it's 1889, as the first Cherokee to convert to Christianity. That's pretty wild. My 4 times great grandmother, her daughter, Quawut was her Cherokee name, but her English name was Elizabeth Graves Terrell. I have to show you this, actually. I wasn't going to, but just popped in my mind. There's a magazine out of Oklahoma called Bartlesville Monthly. And this is from September, last month, right? This is my 4 times great grandmother who's featured on the cover. I mean, look at her. She's a Cherokee cover girl, right? She's a Cherokee supermodel. I woke up one morning and blurry eyed, and I'm checking Facebook, and, you know, I'm a member of all these secret Facebook groups that are closed to folks except Cherokee Nation citizens. And I see her image, and I'm waking up. I'm like, wait, what's going on? That's my grandma. Because I had this image in my campus office at UAS. So I saw this image almost every day. Yeah, she was featured on the magazine. It kind of blew my mind. And so my 5 times great grandmother, my 4 times great grandmother, and my 3 times great grandmother, Nancy Terrell, they were all born in North Georgia near Dahlonega. And Dahlonega, Georgia, Dahlonega is a Cherokee word meaning gold or yellow. And my ancestors had their land taken from them by Georgia, given over to white prospectors in 1832 during America's first gold rush. So by definition, my direct ancestors are old settlers because they were forced into Indian territory 6 years before the formal Trail of Tears. But my great uncle and my great aunt of mine, they did stay behind. They were on the Trail of Tears. And that's a pretty involved story. But up in that area, there is a sacred mountain called Clingman's Dome. And, we visited there on our Trail of Tears trip last fall. And this is a story that takes place there. And I actually got to read this story to my dad and my daughter when we were on top of Clingman's Dome. So here's the story, People Singing in the Earth. This is as it's told by Freeman Al. Long before the tragedies of the people happened, the Cherokees were sitting in a council house. You can imagine this big building sitting on top of a mound with thousands of seats inside. And they're all gathered in the middle of winter, and there's a big fire crackling in the middle of the council. And the chiefs are all gathered in the center, at the bottom, and the people are listening to the oral history being told or to the business being discussed. When all of a sudden, with no wind whatsoever outside, the bear skin on the council house opens up wide enough for a person to come through, and then sort of folds back, and then all of a sudden drops back into place. The Cherokee, believing very much in the spiritual realm as they did in those days, realized that some spirit had entered the council house. So they sat very quietly. And sure enough, up in the corner of the council house, they began to see a light, a sort of greenish light, materialized, and it soon turned into a person. They knew this person was a Cherokee, but they didn't know who he was. He came down to where the chiefs were sitting, and he said, "You, my brothers and sisters, must follow me, for out of the east will come a group of people who will destroy your homes, and your villages will be burned, and your children will be killed, and your homeland will be taken away, and never again will you be happy." And so the Cherokee said, "No, we can't leave, because this land belonged to our mothers, mothers, mothers." And I love that part because that was my grandmother, grandmother, grandmother. And we're a matrilineal culture. He said, "I'll be back in 7 days, and you must fast and decide whether you'll go with me or stay here and suffer." In 7 days, he came back again, and half of the people had decided to follow him, half decided to stay home. And so when he came, the half that followed him went up toward the mountain, the sacred mountain of the Cherokee, and he got to this great massive rock cliff, and he touched it with his hand, and the whole cliff opened up, and you could hear people singing and laughing inside the mountain, and a stairwell leading up to a beautiful land of springtime and summer. The people began to march in with the butterflies flying and the fruit trees bearing fruit, and the people were happy. One man at the end decided that he had left his family there in the village, and he wanted to go back and get them and bring them to this beautiful land. He rushed back to the village and headed back to the mountain. When he got back to the mountain with his family, the mountain had closed up, and they said he was crazy, and they left him there alone. He stayed there for 7 days, and on the 7th day, he began to hear the singing deep within the earth. And so he went back to the village, and from that day forward, he told the people in the village that if you're quiet enough, long enough, and if you sit and listen to the streams, and really are aware and very quiet and still, that you too can hear the people singing within the earth, those happy ones that went on before. And sure enough, the settlers came, and they began to burn the villages and take away the land, and the Cherokee people have been searching for that happiness they had long, long, long ago. So that's the story I'm going to use to sort of start this off with. There's a small part 2 of that in which Freeman Al talks about the meaning of the story, but I'm going to save that for the very end. I adore this story so much because there's something about it that resonates phenomenologically with the inner contours of my sense of self. I know what it means to hear people singing in the earth. But my question becomes, how does that become legible to people who don't have that phenomenological wherewithal, or who think it's crazy to talk about hearing people singing in the earth? How does one hear people singing in the earth? How does it become legible? And this question of legibility is one that I read through another question that's become profoundly important to my work and to my activism. And it's a question posed by Gabrielle Schwab in her book, Haunting Legacies, Violent Histories and Transgenerational Trauma. And if you don't know anything about Gabrielle Schwab, she identifies as a second-generation Holocaust perpetrator. Now, in the course of my graduate studies, I did 3 years of biblical studies because one of my favorite philosophers is a guy named Emmanuel Levanos, who's a Jewish philosopher. I showed up to Purdue University to study his philosophical and phenomenological works, but I did not yet know when I arrived at Purdue the richness of his Talmudic work, the richness of his Midrashic work. And so I did a lot of work with friends who were dealing with literature by second-generation Holocaust survivors. And so it was sort of shocking to me to encounter Schwab, who identified as a second-generation Holocaust perpetrator. She's been doing a lot of work with the Como Pueblo poet Simon Ortiz. And in her book, Haunting Legacies, she asks, how does one think about cultural belonging from the perspective of the victims of colonization on the one hand, and of the descendants of perpetrator nations on the other hand? Contending with transgenerational transmission of trauma born of genocide and colonial violences across their myriad cultural, linguistic, psychological, somatic dimensions, Schwab argues, we have arrived at a place in history where we can no longer afford to deal with the histories of victims and perpetrators in isolation. This work became extraordinarily important for me at UAS as we worked as an institution to decolonize and indigenize. The way that you got non-Indigenous students, staff, and faculty invested in this was to pose this question. How do we translate experience across this spectrum that divides descendants of perpetrators and victims of colonialism? So when we ask about this question of translation or translating experiences, the question becomes one of moral legibility. And for me, I wanted to look at, well, what do we mean by translation? What is entailed in this notion of translating experience? And there's four I can look at right now. There's others that I think about, but there's four ways of thinking about translation that I've been juggling a lot in all of my work. The first comes from my professor, Eric Chaffetz from Cornell University School of Criticism and Theory. And he talks about translation as it sort of derived from its etymology, translatio, or across the oceans. So if we're not careful, translation bears within it that colonial prejudice, the same colonial prejudice that we saw with early anthropology, salvage anthropology, things like this, before we had the brilliant work of like Franz Boas and stuff. The second notion of translation comes from Emmanuel Levanos. Like I said, one of my favorite philosophers, he's Jewish, and he always described his project or his task as translating Judaism into Greek, or he would say translating Jerusalem into Athens. So what he would do is he would take sort of the more sorrowful parts of Western philosophical tradition. And by sorrowful parts, I mean its fascination with power and being, its instrumental rationality, its possessive individualism. And he would kind of gut that and replace it with Jewish sources of inspiration. So that's another way of thinking about translating experience. The third comes from my teacher and dissertation advisor, Sander Goodhart, who talks about translation as a form of transmuting. And I'm going to read a little bit here from this article he wrote in which he talked about the translator's preface to the King James Version of the Bible. And in this essay, I'm going to call him Sandy, but Professor Goodhart, he draws our attention to economies of signification that smuggle within them economies of abjection or sacrifice. And he looks to the translators to the readers, right? This is the preface that the translators of the King James Version of the Bible preface their translation with. And in it, they talk about translation in these richly hospitable terms. So this is the quotation, right? Translation. I don't know if Lauren's here or not, but I feel like Lauren would be good to read this out loud. I don't have a very good Middle English voice, but he says, translation, it is that openeth the window to let in the light, that breaketh the shell, that we may eat the kernel, that putteth aside the curtain, that we may look into the most holy place, that removeth the cover of the well, that we may come by the water, right? Sandy writes, the words are richly hospitable. They speak of opening windows, letting in light to shine upon the darkest, breaking open the shell so that the kernel may be accessed, stripping away the curtain so that the holiest of holies may be revealed. However, toward the end of the King James Version preface, these gestures of hospitality attributed to translation are marked by a profound exclusionary gesture, where the translators exclude, quote unquote, the wicked Jews. They say, ye are brought into fountains of living water, which ye digged not. Do not cast earth into them with the Philistines, neither prefer nor broken pits before them with the wicked Jews. If light be come into the world, love not darkness more than light. And so what Sandy makes about this notion of translation, first as a gesture of hospitality, but then a gesture of exclusion, is that very notion of exclusion, that sacrificial gesture upon which the King James audience or readers are invited to stand, it fundamentally changes the relationship with the language itself, right? I think this is a really brilliant moment where Sandy makes this case that by forcing that exclusionary gesture into the practice of translation, we at once, he says, alter the language in which that exclusionary strategy is deployed, as well as its life-giving breath or spirit. So the fourth notion of translation comes from the Anishinaabe philosopher Gerald Visner, who talks about translation as a trickster hermeneutics. He writes here, the trickster is reason and mediation in stories, the original translator of tribal encounters. The name is an intimation of transformation, men to women, animal to birds, and more than mere causal representation in names. Tricksters are the translation of creation. The trickster creates the tribe in stories and pronounces the moment of remembrance as the trace of liberation. The animals laughed, birds cried, and there were worried hearts over the everlasting humor that would liberate the mind in trickster stories. Trickster stories are the translation of liberation, and the shimmer of imagination is the liberation of the last trickster stories. And so I love to think about translation in those terms as a trickster hermeneutics that translates experience, creation, and liberation. And so when we take up this notion of when we begin with this question of legibility in response to people singing in the earth. What does it mean to hear people singing in the earth? How does that become phenomenologically and morally legible? And that question is shaped by Schwab's insistence that we have to begin the work of translating experience across the spectrum that divides the descendants of perpetrators and victims of colonialism. And what I love about all of these notions of translation is they really get to how language shapes the inner contours of self, that how we relate to language actually shapes our perception of the world and what becomes legible to us. And that our relationship to language is not natural, nor is it universal. That it both shapes and is shaped by modalities of consciousness that we adopt or that we have been educated in, right? And this is where I think phenomenology becomes so important for us, because it's phenomenology that attends to those inner contours of self. It's phenomenology that attends to questions of what becomes legible to us, what appears to us, and what will remain illegible to us. Phenomenology attends to our relationship to language, the modalities of consciousness that we adopt, and what appears to us. I'm going to give a quick definition of phenomenology, though, which comes from my friend Lisa Gunter, who has written a lot. She's done a lot of work with phenomenological critiques of solitary confinement. And this is such an easy, accessible definition of phenomenology. She says, phenomenology is a philosophical method for uncovering the structure of lived experience by describing what it is like from a first-person perspective. Rather than attempting to prove a set of objective facts, phenomenology tracks the way that a meaningful experience of the world emerges for someone in the total situation of their being in the world. It's not that facts are unimportant, but rather that they are not meaningful in themselves. They become meaningful when they are experienced by someone in relation to a wider context or horizon. All right.
Could you repeat that, Saul?
Sure thing.
One more time. Thank you.
You got it. Phenomenology is a philosophical method for uncovering the structure of lived experience by describing what it is like from a first-person perspective. Rather than attempting to prove a set of objective facts, phenomenology tracks the way a meaningful experience of the world emerges for someone in the total situation of their being in the world. It's not that facts are unimportant, but rather they are not meaningful in themselves. They become meaningful when they are experienced by someone in relation to a wider context or horizon. And, I like that a lot, because when I teach like intro to literary studies or literary theories, I with my students, I distinguish between literature and the literary. Literature is the artifact on the shelf, right? It's the book. That's the artifact. That's literature. But the literary is the way we relate to it. The literary is a verb, right? Like the self. The self is a verb. Soren Kierkegaard tells us that, and so does Sly Stone. If we have any fans of Sly and the Family Stone, my first CD, it was Anthology, and I never forget. I opened it up, and in the liner notes it said Sly Stone, and right next to his name it had the little dictionary symbol for verb. I was like, yeah. On my tombstone, I wanted to say Saul Neely, verb. But it's that act of relating. It's the verb. So let me tell another story then. And this will be a story that's the other end of people singing in the earth. This is an ancient Greek story. It's maybe some of you know this story. It's the story of Plato's ideal city, the Republic. Plato's Republic is interesting because it begins as a question of justice. What is justice? And it becomes a question of education. Who gets to educate the citizens? Who gets to educate the teachers? We get, through the course of all 10 books of the Republic, a pretty extraordinary array of literary techniques. We get the metaphor of the sun. We get the analogy of the divided line. We get the allegory of the cave. We get the myth of the metals in justifying the noble lie that leaders are obligated to tell their people. So it's kind of shocking at the end, then in book 10, when Plato delivers the coup de grace and decides to banish the storytellers from his ideal city, right? It's in book 10 where he gives his most explicit theory of forms, in which he makes the argument that the poets, the storytellers, they confuse us, right? They get us thinking about this world, whereas the philosophers get us thinking about the world of forms, the stable, static world of being that never changes, that's never in a process of becoming like this world. And it's interesting when he finally banishes the poets, because he tells us a couple of things. One, poets attend to the emotional part of our soul, right? So if you remember, Plato forwards this tripartite notion of the soul: the rational, the appetitive, and the spirited, right? And those three parts of the soul correspond with three classes in society. The rational part corresponds to the philosophers and the rulers. The spirited part of the soul corresponds with the guardians or the auxiliary in our ideal society. And then the appetitive corresponds to the producers and the consumers in our society. And when he banishes the poets, he says it's because they get us worked up and seduced by the feminine part of the soul. He specifically invokes feminine. I like to remind my students that when Plato sacralizes rationality in his Republic, he does it by abjecting the feminine. He does it against the feminine. There is no reference to logocentrism in the history of Western philosophy that is not from the beginning anti-feminine, right? That's just important to know. There is no logocentrism that isn't at the same time against women. But what does Plato's story do, right? I mean, and that's it. He makes this very storied argument as to why we should kick out the storytellers. But it does a couple of things. One, it ties a particular notion of truth to knowledge, right? He says at the beginning of book 10, we will banish the storytellers, or he says, poetry is ruinous to those who hear it, unless as an anecdote, they have precise knowledge of the original forms. Precise knowledge of the original forms, right? So he sets up this notion of truth that's tied to knowledge. He sets up a logocentrism that's always already engendered masculine. He creates a relationship to story that is subservient to or in service of rationality. And 4, he develops a particular modality of consciousness, right? A particular modality of consciousness. And this is what we can call a consciousness of seeing. Knowledge for Plato and all of Western philosophy that comes in the wake of it, whatever their disagreements might be, right? Knowledge is linked to a consciousness of seeing, which is expressed when we come to learn something like, oh yeah, I see what you mean, right? And, you know, Levanos, as a Jewish philosopher, is one of the first to offer a systematic critique of a consciousness of seeing. But even within Western philosophy, Nietzsche does a little bit of that. At one point, he makes this joke about how come philosophers always privilege the eyes in seeing? What if they privilege the nose, right? I think that's awesome, right? We know how smell is tied to memory. I mean, why not? Why don't we have a consciousness of smelling, right? But truth is tied to knowledge, which means that ethics, the ethical in Western philosophy, is always secondary to the epistemological, always secondary. Ethics is always a moment within knowledge. But if you look at, for Levanos, in Judaism, he talks about how knowledge is secondary to ethics. Ethics is first philosophy. And when you look at indigenous oral literary traditions, I would make the same argument. Knowledge is important, profoundly important, but it's in service of ethical relating. And so we can think about shifting from a consciousness of seeing to a consciousness termed hearing. And I'll give you a couple of examples here in thinking about how radical this shift is. This is the moment where I like to say, pardon my language, okay? It's kind of a mind fuck, right? I mean, when you're really thinking about shifting modalities of consciousness and learning what becomes legible to us through these shifting modalities of consciousness and the way that we experience a different kind of embodiment. This is really profoundly important. And so, there are some brilliant literary traditions in which this consciousness of hearing is prioritized or celebrated, right? Toni Morrison in the preface to Tar Baby writes, "My ear is so close to the radio, I have to be shouted away lest it ruin my hearing forever. Or I am cross-legged on the linoleum floor, breathing through my mouth, rapt, watching the giveaway eyes of the grown-up telling the story. All narrative begins for me as listening. When I read, I listen. When I write, I listen for silence, inflection, rhythm, rest. Then comes the image, the picture of things I have to invent." I love that. Lucius T. Outlaw, who is an African-American philosopher, professor emeritus at Vanderbilt University, wrote this great article on critical theory in the interest of African Americans. And in it, he talks about hermeneutical understanding, right? Works of interpretation is an experiential encounter with a heritage, a tradition, which speaks through the work, say a text, or life praxis or form of expression. The nature of this experiential encounter is complex, but involves, among other things, first hearing the questions or issues that give rise to the work, the praxis, the forms of expression. The process of achieving hermeneutical understanding is thus a dialogue between interpreter and object to be understood. He says, thus, hearing the work requires that one as interpreter come to share, by way of the appropriation of meaning, the world that the work and its language praxis reveals to us. So when you sit down with a book of poetry by Paul Dunbar, you have to hold that book in your hands and hear through it the conditions that give rise to it, right? Theodore Adorno says the conditions of truth is to allow suffering to speak. This is what we have to hear through the text. There is no room for this hearing of a text in Aristotle. Right? This is one of the things I tell my students, whether you've read any Aristotle or not, if you've been educated in Western philosophical traditions or public education school systems, you are an Aristotelian, right? Almost all of our classic college disciplines have their origin in a book that Aristotle wrote, right? But for Aristotle, this sense of hearing doesn't even exist. And I remind students too that Plato and Aristotle in the history of Western philosophy have different starting points, right? But they share one thing in common, and that is for both philosophers, story becomes secondary to rationality. Story is always secondary. And then finally, Emmanuel Levanos, he writes, in sound and in the consciousness termed hearing, there is in fact a break with the self-complete world of vision and art. In its entirety, sound is a ringing, clanging scoundrel, whereas in vision, form is wedded to content in such a way as to appease it. In sound, the perceptible quality overflows so that form can no longer contain its content. And so there are models, there are histories, there are practices of thinking about consciousness in terms of hearing as opposed to seeing. And we're not fetishizing particular, perception. I'm not fetishizing hearing over sight, but it's a matter of what becomes legible to us by adopting different modalities of consciousness, different ways of relating to language, different ways of experiencing self and other relationships. All right. So one example I like to give when I'm talking about these kinds of issues is my friend Une Lance Twitchell, who's Tlingit. He came into my office one day on campus at UAS, and he sat down and he closed the door, and he just started talking about boarding school experiences. And he said about the boarding schools that They beat our language out of us and they replaced it with a language that hates us. And this was such a profound moment. I mean, this must have been 5 years ago, and I haven't stopped thinking about it ever since. What does it mean to talk about a language that hates us? And this is, again, where I think phenomenology is so helpful in teasing the meaning of this out. I'm thinking about the micro, there's a term I like from Gayatri Spivak, the micrological textures of power. The micro-logos, the micrological textures of power, the way that language scores the inner contours of self, and the way that we can be educated with the language that hates us. When we think about micrological textures of power, and we're thinking about translating experience between descendants of victims and perpetrators of colonialism, and we're thinking about what becomes legible to us in the decolonial imperative, there's another word I like to raise, and that's the word percepticide. Percepticide. Now that term percepticide was coined by Diana Taylor in a book she wrote on the Argentine Dirty War. And there's this famous photograph of a cafe. This photograph is taken from outside of a cafe in Argentina. And inside the cafe, you can see a woman sitting at a table, reading her book with her coffee. And immediately outside the glass wall, there are soldiers that are just beating down this young man in a spectacle of disappearance. And what Diana Taylor says is, in that moment, one of the worst things about the Argentine Dirty War is the way it made people turn away. And that moment you turn away, refusing to bear witness to the violence that's taking place right there, it does something to the inner contours of self. And I think that insofar as this country has never reconciled or developed a tragic conscience for slavery and genocide and ethnic cleansing, I think as long as we turn away, we suffer that same kind of percepticide. But my friend, Michael D'Angeli, who's Tsimshian, her and her husband run a world famous dance troupe called Get Hyatt's People of the Copper Shield. And they go all over the world dancing. And she said one time at a presentation she gave at UAS that when she's dancing in front of non-native audiences, she can literally feel herself disappear before their eyes. And I'm thinking that's another kind of percepticide, right? And then when we think about Levanos's critique of a consciousness of seeing, that's his problem with a model of knowledge predicated on vision and visibility, is that we see the other and we act as if we know them. We see them and we act as if we know them. And so the mystery of the other gets lost. That's the difference between knowledge within a consciousness of seeing and knowledge within a consciousness termed hearing. Within a consciousness of seeing, when we encounter something that's not familiar to us, we immediately index it to something that is familiar to us, right? We index it to something that's familiar to us. And in so doing, the mystery, the alterity of the other is lost. It becomes nothing but ego. When we encounter that which is not familiar to us, and we index it to something that is familiar to us and call that knowledge, that is the empire of the ego. But within a consciousness termed hearing, knowledge preserves within it the mystery and the secrecy and the alterity of the other.
None of these people look indigenous.
So important. All right, so I'd like to finish the story with two things here. One, let me return to Freeman Owl and the end of his story. This is his reading. This is his interpretation of the story. He says, and I think the teaching of this story of people singing in the earth, not only was the fact that there was a revelation of what was about to happen, people losing their homeland on the Trail of Tears and so on, but also to teach us that we should never let the child disappear from us. You remember when you were a child, when you would take off your shoes and prod through the mud puddles and laugh and sing. Remember when you were a child that not a butterfly passed that you didn't see it and chase it, and not an animal or an insect were overlooked, that you were so close to nature and so close to Mother Earth that those were the things that were important to you. We should remain like children and sometimes take our shoes off and prod through the mud puddles and sit by the streams and listen to the talking of the streams and the whispers of the wind. We must preserve the earth, and we must value the lives of our elders and the lives of our children and save them a place to live. And I would argue that we're not doing that. We're not saving a place for our children to live. I'm going to end with one more story. And this is actually a Jewish story. So I've told a Cherokee story, a Greek story, and now a Jewish story, okay? I'm an ecumenical thinker. It's a story that comes from Levanos's book, 9 Talmudic Readings, in an essay called The Temptation of Temptations. And he talks about, it's a midrash on the moment. It's a midrash on Exodus 19:17, and they stopped at the foot of the mountain. And we are told that when the Jews arrived to the foot of the mountain, that the Holy One, blessed be he, inclined the mountain over them like a tilted tub. And that he said, if you accept the Torah, all is well. If not, here will be your grave. Right? So this is kind of a phenomenal story. What does this mean? That God picks up a mountain, holds it over the heads of the Jews and says, if you will accept Torah, you will thrive here. If not, this will be your grave. Well, one of the rabbinic responses is that in that moment, the Jews committed and then heard the terms of that commitment. Levanos finds this astounding, that the Jews in that moment commit to a doing before a hearing. That's the opposite of the Socratic, which is to first hear and then determine whether or not you want to do it. And I'll make this fast because we're running out of time, but the way Levanos ends up reading this is that commitment to doing before hearing is the very commitment of inspiration, linked to the literalness of respiration, where we breathe in and we breathe out. We breathe into inspiration, we breathe out into exhaustion. That's the honest cadence of our lives. And moreover, the commitment to doing before hearing becomes a commitment to doing in order to hear, in order to hear. So this comes back to, what does it mean to hear people singing in the earth? It's a commitment to doing in order to hear. And this is the argument I make about decolonial justice. You know, at UAS, when we talked about decolonizing non-Indigenous students, faculty, and staff, all the time, the first response was, first tell me what decolonizing means. And then I will hear the terms of it and decide whether or not I want to do it. And I tell this story as a response, and I say, you will never be able to hear the terms of decoloniality. They will never become legible to you unless you commit to doing it first. So I'm going to end it there because it looks like we have like 5 minutes. There's a lot missing here, but you know, that's a broad, comprehensive arc of where my scholarship is coming and where it's going.
So let's give Saul a round of applause. I don't know if he has a 1 o'clock class, so I don't know if he has time for questions.
That was awesome.
Thank you.
That was awesome. I liked the way how you took the field of phenomenology and connected it to your Native American heritage, to religion, to larger societal issues like education, more current issues, and you know, wrapped it up and brought us back together to the present, and which reminds me of my own phenomenological searches and tells me that I have not really reached out to the places that you have done. So, this presentation reminds me of what a beginner I am in this field, and I admire you. It was really, really groundbreaking and really, really enlightening. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that very much. It's a lot to digest, I know.
Yeah, it was a lot to digest. But Saul, I can't help thinking too, and you've already mentioned this, but there's also, in terms of, I've just been hearing about also families of slave owners and families of slaves, people who are trying to also come together and sharing grief and healing, the few and hopefully more that might try to do that. And the same in what you're saying with colonizers and the colonized, somehow making that attempt rather than turning away from that history. There's a lot of intersectionality in our country with those things. And it's just really interesting. I'm wondering how much of that sort of crosses over from indigenous experiences with that process and also, the Black experience with slavery. And I'm just wondering how much of that you've heard of crossing over or not.
Yeah, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests, there's been so much, Indigenous Black solidarity across the lines. I have profound respect for a number of my Cherokee colleagues who have been speaking about this recently, just a lot of good solidarity, intersectional solidarity. And that's why it was no accident that I read, when I'm talking about a consciousness termed hearing, I'm giving examples from Toni Morrison, I'm giving examples from Lucius Outlaw, also thinking about Cornel West, who talks about John Coltrane. When you hear Coltrane, you've got to hear his suffering come through that horn. What is it that becomes legible to us, I think is so fascinating. And, it's also a strange thing too, because, Cherokee Nation, Cherokee people adopted the institution of slavery as part of the attempt to assimilate. And so there were Cherokee slaveholders, and some of them took their former slaves or slaves with them to Indian territory. So we had the whole freedman thing and whatnot. But yeah, I think it intersects really well. I love teaching. Three times I've taught a class on Toni Morrison, where we read 10 of her novels in a single semester. And I have to start off, my semester with this kind of a presentation. When you're reading like Song of Solomon or something, there's a work like that is a saturated phenomenon. This is a phrase I get from a Catholic phenomenologist named Jean-Luc Marion. He talks about a saturated phenomenon. And a book like that is saturated with meaning and significance. And it only becomes legible if you adopt different lines of approach. And so I think it intersects in really rich ways. And one more reason why it does is because, we got to think about, here's a really difficult starting point for thinking about all of this in terms of relating Indigenous experiences to Black experiences in America. Michel Foucault makes this thesis in a set of lectures he gave called Society Must Be Defended, that the modern nation state as we know it is not born with the cessation of war. It's codified in the mud and blood of war. So that's a really radical Copernican revolution in thinking about historical violence and healing. What if the state is not born with the cessation of war, but is itself codified warfare? You look at the 3/5 compromise clause, you look at, actually, I think some of you might have heard me say this. We had a speaker earlier on in the semester talk about the Constitution on Constitution Day, right? And I had mentioned this claim. You look at the whole history of federal Indian law, I mean, this is a nationalistic legal framework predicated on historical shapes of human abjection. That's what it is. I mean, settler colonialism is a sacrificial national economy. And so it's no wonder that it wants to mute and aggrandize itself as a form of white supremacy. I mean, yeah, anyway, I feel like I'm about to ramble, but I'll just add this one last thing. The bizarre thing about white supremacy, right, which is this idea that European culture and European political traditions are the supreme accomplishment of world civilization, is that it's just not true. I mean, there's great European philosophy and great European literature. I have a PhD in it. I'm not like completely dismissing it. But at some point you begin to realize, like how dry it is, how impoverished it is. And so, I think that's by design. I think that's why it becomes so hard to teach this kind of stuff. And I'm actually giving a talk November 10th for the Middlebury Institute on International Affairs on the phenomenology of land acknowledgements. So I'm still writing that paper, but that'll be fun to think about, the phenomenology of land acknowledgements.
Hey, Saul, may I ask a question? I had to step away. I'm Dr. Janice. I'm the President's Liaison for Native American Affairs, but I'm on a little bit of a hiatus from Heritage, but I wanted to step in and listen to your talk, and I missed some of it just because I had to step away. But when you're talking about the consciousness and I heard the first part of your story, and your father's claim to go elsewhere and do this, go my son, that thought. But I found it interesting because as I stepped away, I had a conversation with a colleague of mine who is a physician, and he said to me in as we were talking about other things related to the work that we're doing, he said, higher education is always talking about being culturally responsive. And he said, what do you folks mean by that? He said, I'm a physician, I'm Native, I provide care here on the Yakima Reservation. And he said, that boggles my mind, because he said, when I hear that from higher education, I wonder what you guys mean by that. What does the academy mean by that? And then you had mentioned something related to land acknowledgement. And then there has been some conversation on Heritage Campus about land acknowledgement, and I think we're all trying to do the right thing. I mean, that's our consciousness, is to do the right thing. At least that's how I believe. Because I feel like that's what I'm trying to do, the right thing. But we have these, land acknowledgement, what is being culturally responsive, and how does that all fit into this conversation? So I'm really delighted to hear, kind of your perspectives on what you presented today in such a, scholarly, manner. The struggle that I had with my dissertation was, that Western way of seeing the world that we've been so inclined to, that our education has pushed us in as Indigenous people. And so when I was working on my dissertation, I really struggled with that. And at the beginning of each of my chapters, in consultation with other Indigenous scholars, I had to come to a place of self-location and honor that self-location. And so, those are the works of scholars, Indigenous scholars, as we talk about and have these conversations. And I don't think I have a question, but I just wanted to make a comment.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And thank you so much for being here. And And yeah, that whole point on cultural responsive, it's really interesting. We did a year of rethinking racism in Juneau, Alaska. And so and that consisted of one November, we had a panel of 6 of us, local activists, and we responded to a community problem we had. It was an awful situation where like these local, relatively progressive people got together and they had a Asian themed party. And those pictures went all over Facebook. And when they were called out on it, they just reacted with a lot of vitriol and insult. But then we had that panel, and then we spent a whole year using these social technologies developed by First Alaskans Institute called ANDOR, Alaska Native Dialogue on Racial Equity. And we hosted a set of these community dialogues and then reported back on them the following November. And my contribution to the panel conversations was to say, listen, we need you to listen to us. The problem is you probably don't know how to listen. And I think that's because when Plato kicked the storytellers out, we lost a rich sense of storytelling in the Western literary tradition. And we can't underestimate the influence that has, because with an impoverished sense of story, we have an impoverished political imagination. Mm-hmm. You know, my work in prisons does this all the time. People act like incarcerated people have no story. You know, you made a bad choice, you made a bad decision. You know, well, what about, you know, this young man who was born into unbelievable trauma, barely survived it? You know, like, how do you deal with the people's stories like that? And so I do think it's hard to listen, but I also really respect what you just said about people who are doing their best, right? And so I like land acknowledgements across this nation right now. People are celebrating them. People are fumbling with them. People are questioning them. What do they mean? Are they just speaking healing words while obscuring the real needs of political processing? You know, what is all of this? But I do celebrate them because I think it is one way of a doing before hearing. Mm-hmm. You know, I really do think it's one of those steps. You know, it's protocol. Right? I think land acknowledgements are a protocol and they're a form of ceremony. And as I've said before, protocol is an expression of sovereignty and ceremony is an expression of jurisdiction. And so I think they're powerful.
You know, I just want to add to, sorry, one more comment, but I hear what you're saying, because when you think of the canoe journey that happens in the Northwest here, and whatever tribe is hosting that canoe journey, before they land on shore, they ask permission to come on. And that's very similar to when we're talking about land acknowledgement. It's permission to be here, you know, and not just stepping on, but having the other person acknowledge, yes, you may come on the homelands. Yes. Yeah, so.
Thank you so much. That was really good.
So this is such an important conversation and we must continue it soon, but I think that we have to end for today. So everyone that's still in the room, please, a great round of applause. Thank you, Maxine, for being here.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Saul.
Please set the link for the recording.